Welcome, everyone. My name is Adam Savitt. I'm Director of Communications at the Center for Security Policy. I'm proud to welcome you to the third webinar in our Biothreats series in support of a launch of our new book, Defending Against Biothreats, What We Can Learn from the Coronavirus Pandemic to Enhance U.S. Defenses Against Pandemics and Biological Weapons. This is the third of 5 webinars featuring the authors of this work. This will continue through the end of next week, so be sure to register for the rest of this series at securefreedom.org. Today's panel is entitled, What Terrorists Will Learn from the 2020 Pandemic, featuring Shoshana Bryen and Sam Faddis, and moderated by my center colleague, Christopher Holton. Please note that you are in listen-only mode, but you can ask questions in the Q&A box on your webinar control panel. This event is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/securefreedom, and on our website at securefreedom.org. And with that, I'll hand it over to my colleague, Senior Analyst, Chris Holton.
Thank you very much, Adam. My name is Christopher Holton. As Adam said, I'm Senior Analyst and Director of State Outreach here at the Center for Security Policy. Welcome to What Terrorists Will Learn from the 2020 Pandemic. I'm very pleased to be able to introduce 2 very distinguished panelists today who contributed chapters to this new book, Shoshana Bryen and Charles Sam Faddis. And I will briefly go through their credentials. Shoshana Bryen is the Senior Director of the Jewish Policy Center and a leading specialist in U.S. defense policy and Middle East affairs. She's the former Executive Director and Senior Director for Security Policy at the Jewish Institute for National Security of America. Mrs. Bryen was author of the widely republished JINSA reports. She has worked with the Strategic Studies Institute of the U.S. Army War College and the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv, and lectured at the National Defense University in Washington. Her work has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Sun, and Defense News, among other outlets, as well as in JINSA reports. Charles Sam Faddis is a former CIA operations officer with 30 years of experience in the conduct of intelligence operations in the Middle East, South Asia, and Europe. Faddis spent 20 years in the Near East and South Asia working against terrorist groups, WMD smuggling networks, and rogue states. His last assignment prior to his retirement in May of 2008 was as head of the CIA's Terrorist Weapons of Mass Destruction Unit. He took the first CIA team into Iraq in the summer of 2002 in advance of the invasion of that country, and has worked extensively in the field with law enforcement, local security forces, and special operations teams. Since retirement from the CIA, he has written extensively, provided training to a wide variety of government and private entities, and appears regularly on radio and television. Their comments today will reflect their chapters from the book, Defending Against Biothreats, What We Can Learn from the Coronavirus Pandemic to Enhance U.S. Defenses Against Pandemics and Biological Weapons. Ms. Bryen and Sam Faddis, thank you very much for joining us today. We'll get right into it. I've got a series of questions, but I don't want this to be too formal. Please feel free to break in at any time to impart your knowledge to our audience. That's our goal here today. My first question really is directed at Ms. Bryen, but as I said, Mr. Faddis, please feel free to chime in at any time. Ms. Bryen, what have the Chinese likely learned about the U.S. and the Western response to the virus, and thus perhaps to any future biological outbreak?
Well, they've learned a lot, and it really doesn't matter whether the virus was planted, planned. It doesn't matter. What they've watched is that we have holes in our systems. They also learned, however, that they have holes in their systems. For example, they've looked at the spread of toxins and viruses. They can be global, but then they can also hit your own people. They impact economic activity, including manufacturing and distribution systems, but they impact your own as well. First responders in the West did not hold up very well. We had shortages of equipment. We had shortages of the right kinds of people, everything from simple things like face masks and hand sanitizer to critical equipment. But you know what? The Chinese found out that they had those same holes. Producing vaccines is slow and difficult. They're having the same problem. They are, in fact, trying very hard to steal our work. At the broader level, what they have learned and what we have learned is that when the United States turns inward and doesn't have enough space, enough bandwidth for foreign policy, hostile states can take advantage of it. They can use deception to hide their own responsibility. In this case, they were helped enormously by the US media, which has been spreading unrest and panic and undermining the trust of the people in their government. At the same time, we're not watching very carefully what they're doing. They've taken advantage of our lack of attention to crack down on Hong Kong, to ramp up operations in the South China Sea, to increase the oppression of the Turkic Uyghurs, their own minority population in the West. And now they're harassing Japan in the East China Sea. So our responses to all of that have been instructive for them. So the next time, if they do it on purpose, not only will they know to watch their own back, but they know where our shortcomings are. And it's not clear that we have improved a whole lot.
And I might add that they've also instigated tension along the border with India in the midst of all that.
India also.
Mr. Faddis, I got a question for you, sir. Because this is a webinar that's supposed to be focused on how terrorists might react as well, would you mind telling our viewers about some of the evidence of Al-Qaeda and Islamic State efforts to pursue biological weapons?
Sure. I think the way to preface this or introduce it is just to say this. There are no terrorist groups, to my knowledge, on the planet in existence, no serious groups, and haven't been for some time, that do not have an interest in acquiring and using biological weapons. So there's going to be a certain amount of information that leaks out into the unclassified press and the media about specific instances, and I'll refer to a couple of those in a minute. But I can tell you that when I was running CIA efforts against terrorist WMD programs, we literally didn't go through 24 hours when we weren't attempting to run down some threat according to related to this. Now, some of those are very immature. Some of those were never going to come to fruition. I'm not suggesting every one of those was a fully formed plot, but this is a huge ongoing area of interest. You cannot seize a computer hard drive in a safe house raid anywhere on the planet and not find gigabytes of information on this topic. So this is not science fiction. It's not maybe somebody cares. It's a given. As far back as when we went into Afghanistan after 9/11, we discovered a fully formed biological weapons program inside Afghanistan that was wrapped around anthrax and attempting to cultivate anthrax and use that as a bioweapon. We continue to find these kinds of programs all over the world. Very recently, within the last couple of years in Syria, there's been documentation about laptops being captured and interest in bubonic plague. And when I say interest, I don't mean like a single random note about the potential of using bubonic plague. I mean reams and reams of data for how to use it, how to grow it, how to disseminate it. So anything we're looking at in terms of terrorist bio programs, we have to view it against that backdrop, that this is every day an interest of some very bad people in using this.
And probably after this pandemic, their interest is probably going up, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, without question. I mean, we have demonstrated that we are nowhere close to being ready to deal with this threat, despite having talked about it for decades and having spent a lot of money on it. So yes, that's just going to pour jet fuel on the fire in terms of interest.
Ms. Bryen, if this virus had actually been an attempt at a biological weapon, how successful was it? Assuming
what are we going to assume?
Well, assuming, let's just, I guess it's a hypothetical. We can't prove that China inflicted this on us purposely, so we're not going to make that assumption. But let's just create our own hypothetical scenario here that let's say that this had been an actual biological attack. as opposed to an accidental release.
Okay.
How successful has it been?
If they really meant to see how destructive they could be in terms of U.S. military forces, it was a failure. It was a huge failure. With the exception of taking the USS Theodore Roosevelt and the kid out of circulation for a little while. And that's a big exception. And that we know that the Roosevelt was in Vietnam and people picked up the virus in Vietnam. But aside from those exceptions, the US military does not appear to have been heavily impacted. Soldiers being young, soldiers being fit, I don't know why exactly, but there has not been any tremendous run of COVID-19 in the US military. And by the way, not in the US National Guard either, although guardsmen and guardswomen have been right in the middle of the pandemic. They have brought relief and testing, including in nursing homes in this country, including in very well-populated, heavily populated places, including in states where the pandemic was running rampant, which is New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and now in Florida. So we don't see guardsmen and women coming down with COVID-19. I'm not sure why. I suspect, and this is a non-medical opinion, but I suspect it's because they're young and they're healthy. They do observe a certain amount of social distancing, although the National Guard certainly was not in a position to. So if I were looking at, can I stop the United States military with this or something like this, I think the answer is no.
Well, that's good news. I didn't expect that.
It is good news, isn't it? It's maybe the only good news that I have, but that is good news, yes.
Mr. Faddis, what's your view on that subject matter? I mean, if this had been a biological attack from other different aspects, what do you think about the success of it?
Well, I guess I'm going to use as my point of departure the comments that you just heard, which is the first question is, what was your goal, right? What was your objective? Obviously, if your objective was make every ship in the 7th Fleet put into port, they didn't come anywhere close to that, and even the Roosevelt probably would have put it back out to sea. Had it in fact been a wartime situation, they would not have been at dock. On the other hand, if your objective was to cause massive economic disruption, billions of dollars in losses, panic, disruption, well, I mean, if that was your objective, you achieved all of those things. We see all of that around you. See all of that around you every day. And one of the spin-offs from that, I guess, one of the things to focus on is we're used to thinking of these biological threats in terms of, you know, it's got to be bubonic plague all over again. It's got to be smallpox. If we're not burying people by the tens of thousands in the streets like they did in medieval Europe, it didn't have an impact. I'm not suggesting that's not still their goal of some very bad people, but this has stopped way short of that and still had done tremendous damage to the U.S. economy and potentially will end up influencing the results of a November election and having all sorts of other ripple effects. So big impact, but again, it depends on what were you looking for?
Along those same lines, but perhaps focusing more on, again, the terrorist threat, Mr. Faddis, what are some of the events that have transpired during the Wuhan virus pandemic that terrorist groups in particular probably closely observed?
Yeah, everything. I mean, you know, look, as I always say, terrorists don't have anything close to our capabilities. They don't have our money. They don't have a SEAL Team 6. They don't have B-52 bombers. They don't approach problems that way. They also don't have any of our moral and ethical limitations, particularly these days in the age of mass casualty events and this kind of thing. So they're looking for what you've forgotten. They're looking for weaknesses, and there are tons of them here. Start with this. Forget about having to build your own anthrax program in the heart of Afghanistan like Al-Qaeda did 20 years ago. They can see that there are lots and lots of organisms that will really mess with people that are easily communicated from one human to another, that are being studied in labs all over the world. And if we're to assume that this was not a deliberate release, which would be my guess at this point, that means that this thing got loose all on its own without any help. Well, if that's how bad the security is and how lax your procedures are, well, then clearly stealing it would not be a particularly difficult task. They can also see that once it was set loose, you don't need a sophisticated dissemination program. You don't need a Manhattan Project to devise a device to spray this stuff around. You just infect other humans with it. Essentially what we would talk about biological martyrs, and start throwing them on planes and have them circulate around the planet. And they can also see that our reaction time is horrifically slow because of bureaucratic problems, because of political problems, because the Chinese won't tell us what's going on, because internally, politically, we got to bicker about what we're going to do, because it turns out the bureaucrats really aren't ready to go to war after all, even though they've been planning for it for 20 years. So get a commonly available organism, infect other people with it, start sending them around the planet, and make no announcement whatsoever about what you're doing until this thing is already raging on every continent on the planet, because you're going to give nobody a chance to have a forewarning. And you will have a replication of what you just saw with at least that kind of effect. And if you found an organism that was more lethal, well, then you really have a problem.
I guess especially one that was just as dangerous to young people as it is to older people. Because this one seems to almost seems to ignore military age service personnel, which in a biological attack, I would assume that would not be something that they would desire. Ms. Bryen, do you have any thoughts on the question of what terrorist groups probably closely observed?
Well, I would just agree with basically everything Sam said, and most specifically, the fact that if it got loose by itself, we have a huge internal laboratory security problem. I don't mean internal to the United States, but laboratories have internal security issues, and we have not done a whole lot about that. There's also the problem of stealing, and as you know, the United States has been the object of efforts to steal viruses and efforts to steal research information by the Chinese and by other people. So to the extent that I'm a terrorist and I'm out there wanting to know what's going on, I completely agree with Sam. The security is not good enough, and we haven't had yet. You want to talk about a Manhattan Project, not to build weapons, but how about a Manhattan Project to secure what we already do?
And that kind of leads me to the next question, Ms. Bryen. Share with our viewers a little bit, what do we know about Chinese espionage targeting U.S. labs? Some of the specific.
We don't know enough, okay? What we know is that scientists in this country who get federal money have to sign a contract that says there is no foreign government, foreign entity involvement in the research, and they can't lie, okay? But thousands of these grants have been given with that language in there, no foreign government involvement, no foreign entity involvement, and people sign them, and no one seems to be enforcing the language of the contract. And sometimes people do lie. So look at only, for example, NIH, and here I'm going to read just a bit because I want the numbers to be right. NIH has fired dozens of scientists in the course of this year for secret financial ties to China. They focused on 285 active grants distributed to institutions in 27 states and 59 cities, totaling $164 million. Now, and this is only NIH. This is not DOD. It's not Health and Human Services, not any other place that people could be looking. They singled out at NIH 399 of what they called scientists of possible concern. And they found that of those 399, 133 had, quote, an undisclosed grant from a foreign government, and 102 had, quote, undisclosed Thousand Talent Award grants. Thousand Talents is China's program to pay Americans a lot of money to get what they know. So that's just NIH. And so once you start to look, you start to find. And even people who are working legally with foreign governments, even people who are working legally with China, there are areas in which we do work legally with China. The price of that cooperation is the surrendering of your intellectual property. That's the way it goes. There is no Chinese business, there is no Chinese university, there is no Chinese entity that doesn't seek to take intellectual property back to China. We sort of know that we really don't do anything about it. So the transfer of information to China has been huge, and the investment by China has not been huge. We are getting farther and farther behind the curve. Everybody should be doing what NIH just did, and I don't see it.
Mr. Faddis, what are your thoughts on some of the information that Ms. Bryen just shared that make me particularly angry?
Well, it ought to make all of us angry. I mean, I'm laughing not because it's funny, obviously, but because the scope of this thing is just so ridiculously large. Let me add this perspective, I guess. My job for a long time was to recruit spies for the U.S. government, right? I mean, that inside Al-Qaeda, inside Russian intelligence, whatever. And that means going head to head with these intelligence outfits around the world. If you're a Chinese citizen and you're studying here at or working here in the United States in any capacity, we'll talk about all these scientists, researchers attending classes, you are at a minimum, you are a spy for the Chinese government. That's not intended to be a slur against these individuals or suggest that they do this willingly. It is to say that that is the reality of the world in which they live. If I'm a Chinese citizen and I'm here, I do not live in the same world where a U.S. citizen would live, where if the FBI or CIA came and asked for your cooperation, you would be free in most cases to simply say, I decline. As a Chinese citizen, you don't have any such capacity to do that. You are subject to pressure. Your family is subject to pressure. It is an offer you can't refuse. So therefore, the idea that you are going to admit people to situations where they have access to information we don't want to get back to the Chinese government, have them sign a paper or make any other kind of affirmation, and then rely on that is just ludicrous. I may be the Chinese citizen who despises the CCP more than you could possibly imagine and wishes every day for a free democratic China. It doesn't change the reality of my existence. I have no capacity to resist this. I must do what I'm told to do. Now, I can try to drag my feet and I can try to be of as little help as possible, and I can hope they get tired of talking to me and they go away. But I cannot refuse that. Therefore, every time you admit somebody like this, you have to assume baseline, from my standpoint, from my world of intelligence and counterintelligence, that individual, everything they see, I am prepared for them to pass it to the Chinese government. That's just the reality. It will always be the reality as long as we have a communist regime. So again, if you look at it through that lens, it's suicidal as a nation to therefore allow them to have access to this. We should have recognized that a long time ago. And then anybody that we are going to admit, well, then we ought to have a very intense counterintelligence focus on them, which I see some indications is increasing, but I would submit to you is still nowhere near intense enough.
What about Ms. Bryen and Mr. Faddis? What about when it works the other direction? Because shortly after the beginning of the pandemic, it was revealed by the Wuhan Virology Lab's own website that they had partnerships with the University of Alabama, the University of North Texas, and Harvard. Now, I expect that of Harvard, to be honest with you, but University of North Texas and University of Alabama, those are public institutions, so there should be some form of oversight going forward on that. But what is the nature of that partnership when universities here in the United States are partnering with a lab over there? How does that benefit communist China, and how does that endanger lives and intellectual property here in the United States?
But I would just say it doesn't matter, excuse me, it doesn't matter if the labs are there or the labs are here. American universities and Chinese universities spend a lot of time in each other's pockets. But as Sam very clearly pointed out, they are different. The Chinese have an obligation to their governments that American researchers do not have. We permit it. Part of us likes it because the Chinese pay American institutions. Harvard was making a lot of money allowing Chinese scientists to work there with Dr. Lieber, and Dr. Lieber's now been arrested, but they pay a lot of money for this. And so American universities say to themselves, look, we'll take the money. We're not doing anything bad. The U.S. government doesn't forbid it, and it's true. The U.S. government doesn't forbid it in most cases. That's a shortcoming. So whether they go off to China to study or the Chinese come here to study, there is a missing link, and the missing link is American security interest.
Yeah, I would agree with that wholeheartedly, and I would add this as an observation. You know, Americans, this is probably true of academics, scientists worldwide, certainly characteristic of the Americans that we're talking about who are often involved in these ventures. They don't look at the world through intelligence and counterintelligence glasses. God bless them, because I don't wish that upon anybody, to spend all of your life thinking like a spy and being suspicious of everybody's motives. Makes it hard to go to bed at night sometimes. But the point is, they're in it for, you know, Harvard is making a lot of money, but the individuals involved are often just there for the academic pursuit of whatever. And they assume that their Chinese counterparts are driven by the same considerations and just are completely blind to this entire dimension that exists around them. So they're working with this guy, these folks in China, and they assume this is a wonderful sort of globalist, we're all here in the pursuit of knowledge kind of atmosphere, and completely unaware, it just never occurs to them that there's this entire other thing going on in the background, that all of their data is being stolen off their laptops, that the guy they're talking to is reporting to the Chinese, that the Chinese intelligence service has direct access to all of their information and all of their work. And that's sometimes very difficult to counter. And honestly, frankly, a lot of times those Americans don't want to get involved in helping the American government. I'm not suggesting they're unpatriotic, maybe some are, but just because that's not what they're in it for. They want to just have this pursuit of knowledge and not get pulled into all this geopolitical stuff.
I would add one more thing to that, and that is that it's harder with China than it was with Russia. When we had the Cold War and people saw the Soviet Union as an enemy force, and partly because it was close enough after the occupation of the Warsaw Pact countries by the Soviet Union, we knew who the enemy was. People would say, oh no, Russia, that's Soviet Union, that's bad, and they didn't really want to work with it. We have spent decades looking at the Chinese not as bad, not as adversarial, not as people who want to take over parts of the things that we do or parts of the things that we are. And that attitude has led to a lot of what Sam just described. People who think that it's okay in pursuit of academic ends or intellectual ends to be friends with the Chinese where they never were friends with the Russians.
I think that's a great point. China has always been viewed as an opportunity and Russia as an adversary, and we're learning the truth now. Mr. Faddis, how might terrorist groups in particular craft future biological attacks to exploit our current weaknesses? You discussed this in your chapter, so I don't want anybody thinking that I'm asking you to give the terrorists advice, but what might they do that we need to be prepared for?
Yeah, always a challenge in writing about terrorist matters to not provide a primer for the enemy. Well, look, I touched on this a few minutes ago. If it were me standing in the shoes of my adversary, which I spent a lot of my life doing that in one way or the other, I would look at what just happened and replicate it. I would go find an organism that I can acquire from a lab, and they are by this point not just in China but all over the planet messing with these things. Identify that organism, One of the key considerations would be, obviously, it needs to be as easily disseminated from human to human as possible. It needs to be as lethal as possible, but not to sound super cold-blooded, not kill people too quickly, not kill them before they have a chance to breathe on a lot of other people. And then I would start just replicating precisely what you saw. I mean, this thing did a very good job of spreading itself all over the planet just by hitching rides on aircraft and ships and so forth. Put people on planes and fly them to Heathrow and fly them to every other major airport. And then after they get there, you know what? They can just wander around that airport for a long, long time, infecting everybody, who then jumps on a plane and flies off. When you look at models of this, you see it, you know, you see what it looks like. It looks like an explosion from every major aircraft hub on the planet, and from there to regional airports and so on. I would essentially, and again, I touched on this earlier, and say nothing about it. I mean, I'm not saying ultimately you wouldn't take responsibility, but you do not make an announcement that we just turned loose this organism. You wait until the emergency rooms are full and the panic has ensued and it has spread already to the 7 corners of the globe before you tell anybody what is ongoing. And if you do that, you do it just to add more hysteria. They have literally been provided with a roadmap here, and both in terms of the availability and access to these organisms, and in fact in terms of how hesitant and inefficient and slow the response was. And I think one of the big factors that is probably eye-opening for them, and should be for us, is when you war game these things, you always think in terms of people just doing the most efficient thing. Okay, we sit around a table, command post exercise. What do we do now? There's a virus, Liz. We don't even consider the fact that we have the political angle of this, the arguing about what to do, the optics of this, whether we're going to ban travel or whether we're not going to ban travel as it impacts a coming election or doesn't. And I'm not taking any political side in that. I'm just saying that means there's a whole dimension to this that we've never war gamed really and never replicated. So I would just take the coronavirus situation and say, hey, that worked great. The only thing it would be better from the standpoint of a horrible terrorist, if it killed more people. If we can find something like that that does the same thing, we're off to the races tomorrow.
Mrs. Bryen, your thoughts?
You know, my thought was, as I was listening to Sam, who's scaring me to death, by the way, is exactly that. It used to be that our enemy had nuclear weapons, and we had the time, and we planned what we would do about a nuclear strike, whether it was large scale or small scale, whether it was on an adversary or it was on ourselves. And most Americans could go to bed at night thinking that we had some mechanism to deal with a nuclear strike. And that was probably the biggest thing that could happen to us. So if you had your bomb shelter in the backyard, you were fundamentally safe. Today, the issue is everywhere. It's on the countertop in the store. It's in the bathroom of the airport. It's in places that you can't even imagine are places. And so we've gone from the very highest level of threats, but very few of them. The Russians had a certain number of nuclear weapons, and we could target them, and the Chinese had a certain number, and we don't worry about British or French nuclear weapons, so they don't count, to something that can get you any day in any place. And that, I think, is, as Sam correctly said, the wargaming for that doesn't happen. I think it's because we're not accustomed to the idea that you have to wargame small. We're still talking about missile defenses. We're still talking about drone technology, and we have to talk small. We're not there.
Yeah, I would add this. I mean, there's a huge difference between, we all know this, but I mean, there's a huge difference between discussing things and doing tabletop exercises and thinking about problems, and then actually being prepared to do what is needful. I mean, the U.S. military lives on this principle, right? You have to be prepared to deploy on 24 hours notice to the 82nd Airborne. They don't have a plan for, I mean, they have a plan for that. And then periodically they make the entire division get on planes and go jump out of aircraft somewhere and actually physically do it. Because the distance between the plan and actually getting everybody onto those aircraft and out of those aircraft, et cetera, it can be vast. And that's the only way you really know if you can do it. Not sure that we have really ever done that in regard to this kind of threat. And there's a point here, obviously, at which we don't want to scare the country to death. And we don't want everybody running around all the time thinking that they're about to be killed by biological weapons. But there's got to be some kind of happy medium here where, because right out of the blocks, in many cases, not just this one, we have demonstrated that we haven't ever actually physically walked through this. I would reference a couple of years ago, there was a big Ebola outbreak in West Africa, as there's periodically, and we ended up with a case of Ebola. I believe it was in Atlanta, don't hold me to that, with an American citizen who was infected and very advanced. And so now you have all this bedding and so forth, soaked in infected blood, et cetera, has to be disposed of. Well, they had thought about that, how they would go contain an apartment in this situation. And they had actually in Atlanta a identified incinerator where you could destroy this medical waste. As soon as they went to transport it, they discovered that constitutes hazardous waste, and you need a special permit to get onto the federal highway to move from point A to point B. No one had ever done this or walked through it or considered it. So therefore, they couldn't actually move the medical waste from the apartment to the incinerator. They just had to stockpile it in the apartment until they resolved this issue. Okay, that's a single case, but it's a clear demonstration that, okay, well, that's great. You talked about it a lot, but nobody ever actually went through it, because this is precisely what happens when you take that academic exercise and turn it into reality. That's the whole point of drills, is to demonstrate all that stuff that nobody thought about, but ends up being a game-changing consideration. And I think there's a big piece of that in what we have just seen all over the country. Early on in this pandemic, some cases we had EMS personnel taking people with COVID out just wearing their typical EMS gear. Other cases they were in bubble suits and wrapping people up, and clearly kind of making it up as they went along. Like, what is the protocol here? We never thought about it.
I read something about WMD years ago that said that you don't want to be in the same city as a chemical attack. You don't want to be in the same state as a thermonuclear attack, but you don't want to be on the same continent as a biological attack. But it sounds like there's not even any safety by being on a different continent because of the scenarios that both of you all have described. So in the time we have left before we switch to the Q&A, can you both briefly go over some of the suggestions that you all have that we as a country need to take, some of the steps that we need to take to improve our capability to respond to these threats and to defend against them? I'll go with you first, Mrs. Bryen.
Well, aside from what appears to be evident now, which is stronger security for laboratories, I would say the first thing would be to suspend U.S.-sponsored biological research with China for Class A bioterrorism agents. Those are the ones that are defined as organisms that pose a risk to national security. And then I would expand Class A to include all coronaviruses. Secondly, urge American scientists not to do this work with the Chinese. There are plenty of other ways to do it, other places to do it. I would also cancel visas for Chinese scientists that want to come and do that kind of research in this country. So yes, it's the barn door, and yes, the horse is out. But if you want to begin to get a handle on it, those two things are important. Third, I am not a big believer in the International Court of Justice, but in this case, we might want to band together with some other countries and take China to the court to try to enforce, first of all, compensation, but secondly, to try to figure out what happened in China and to hold them accountable for what happened in China. As I said earlier, I'm not sure that this was a deliberate bio attack on the rest of the world, but the Chinese really do need to be held accountable. And third, I would start creating the follow-up committee. And the follow-up committee should have been in the World Health Organization. I'm not sure that I trust it at this point. You may want to have a follow-up committee of democratic countries, which, by the way, means including Taiwan, which is not a member of WHO, but which had tremendous success in containing the virus in Taiwan. So maybe we need a club of democracies. Maybe we need a club of friends and allies. And the third thing that I would do is actually reinforce my military position in the Pacific. Guam, Japan, Okinawa, we are at the moment reducing our bomber forces in Guam. I think it's a really bad idea. We should bolster our forces there, because if this is part of a larger Chinese effort to attack our friends and allies, to harass them at our expense, we have to make it clear that we are there for them. We might want to consider basing air defense systems in Taiwan. That would be a huge step forward. And we have to ask Japan to change its mind. Japan has recently said it was going to cancel its missile defense systems in the Akita prefecture. We have to get them to change their minds. And look for new allies in the region. Everybody's nervous. The Australians have made a huge new investment in defense and defense spending. It's a great ally for us. Taiwan, great ally for us. I know for some people the idea of doing security things with Vietnam is a really weird thing, but the Vietnamese have been trying very hard to be on our side of this issue. So my last thing would just be to watch China much more carefully and not let the Chinese get away with what they think they're getting away with right now, and finding the allies to do it.
Thank you, Mr. Bryen. Mr. Faddis?
Well, let me throw this in, because I feel like we haven't touched on this piece so far. We're all talking about or referring to this Wuhan lab. I think probably the consensus is this was not a deliberate release, but on balance, this thing almost certainly started in this lab, and somehow got out. But we're guessing, and we clearly had no forewarning. When the Chinese didn't volunteer information, we clearly did not have much in the way of information to add to the picture. What happened? When did it happen? What exactly are we dealing with? That's crazy. I mean, speaking from an intelligence perspective, biological threats are at the top of our target list for every intelligence agency the U.S. government has and have been for years, certainly with CIA for decades. The Chinese are not friends. The Wuhan lab was not an unknown location. The Department of State, for the love of God, is writing cables warning us about the possibility of a pandemic. As a CIA officer, to have to say that the Department of State is scooping us on intelligence threats, that almost sticks in my craw coming up. No offense to my Foreign Service colleagues. This is a major target of American intelligence, and there should have been no ambiguity. There shouldn't have been anything on a computer system at Wuhan Lab we didn't see. There should have been multiple sources inside Wuhan Lab. You should have known chapter and verse before Beijing knew what was going wrong in Wuhan Lab. That's what a lot of guys and gals get paid to do. That's a big problem. And if that's the intelligence posture we're going to stay in with biothreats, we're really in a world of hurt. I mean, if you have no forewarning and we're stuck with doing nothing but reacting to a pandemic that's already raging, yeah, well, I mean, then your options are really, really limited. Somebody should have been telling us years ago, get ready, because this thing is coming out of the Wuhan lab, and this is precisely what the heck it is, and these are precisely its characteristics. That's the entire point of the intelligence community. So I don't say that to badmouth everybody in the intelligence community, because it's filled largely with really, really good folks. It's to say that as an apparatus, it is not getting the job done. And somebody should be shaking the trees and finding out why and fixing that right now.
And I would like to add to that. Clearly, our focus is China right now. But if you look at the countries that, for example, the Arms Control Association says are engaged in bioweapons research, we need a really big intelligence effort here, because it's not just China. It's Cuba, Egypt, North Korea, Syria, Russia. You know, there are a lot of countries that are engaged in this at the same time. And I wouldn't bet on the security of an Egyptian lab. You know, I'm not betting on the security of a Chinese lab. I'm not betting on the security of an American lab. Syria, you know, how much security do you suppose they have in Syria on their lab? So agreeing clearly with Sam that intelligence is lacking. It's not just on China. It's in a lot of places.
What about Iran? I noticed that there was a passage in the book that indicated that Iran was working on weaponizing fentanyl. I work a lot with law enforcement around the country, and let me tell you, law enforcement in this country is very concerned about going into any environment where fentanyl exists, because it can make you really sick and it can kill. And now we've seen that evidently Iran is working on weaponizing it.
I haven't seen that one specifically, but you can imagine that the weaponization of lots of things is ongoing, fentanyl not being all that difficult to get, so that you have the option of playing around with it. I would just like to point out that over the last 48 hours, a lot of people in the United States have received packages of seeds that appear to have come from China. Happily, these people are tuned in enough, smart enough, weirded out enough that they are reporting this to their state departments of agriculture. I know here in Maryland, we got an alert from the Department of Agriculture. There is some belief that those seeds have been tampered with, that they are not just seeds to plant things. Anyway, you didn't order seeds, so what are you getting seeds for? Seems harmless, maybe not harmless. If it comes from China, maybe it's not harmless. So fentanyl, sure, why not? Seeds, why not? Whatever's out there, folks.
Thank you very much, both of you. This has been incredibly enlightening. Usually in the last 15 minutes or so of a webinar, we like to open up the floor to questions through our question feature on the control panel. And at this point, Adam Savitt will throw those questions at you all. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed meeting both of you virtually.
Thank you.
So to touch on one of those non-China threats, what biological programs does Russia still retain, and could they pass materials or knowledge to terrorist actors?
So I mean, so the question, it's a good question, and that even within the intelligence community, I think you're going to find that the answer is we're not sure. But everybody, the Russians, the Chinese, everybody retains at a minimum a program focused on defending themselves against biological weapons, or framed in those terms. The distinction between a defensive program and an offensive program is largely semantics. I mean, if you have the only way you can research defensive mechanisms is by actually having the organisms that you're worried about, which means you have the capacity to have a program at any point in time. Would the Russians pass such biological agents to a terrorist group? I don't know. I mean, as a general proposition, don't really like to rely upon the goodwill of adversaries. On the other hand, they would probably worry about themselves should something get loose. But something that was referred to earlier is, once we were talking about Syrian program, for instance, having biological agents. Well, now we are in the case of Russia, the same kind of thing. We are now fully dependent upon their security. We're fully dependent upon whether or not anybody can find a Russian scientist who just needs a few extra bucks in his bank account to buy. We are stuck with their systems, which means we have no control at all. And frankly, the Russians have limited control because they can't stop people from stealing things out of these programs. So we're going to have programs and labs And we're going to have government labs and commercial labs all over the world that have the materials you need to cause a pandemic. Unfortunately, that's where we live now.
And raising Russia raises one other thing. The Russians, as we know, do anthrax, and they had a what's called a bio accident as late as last year. So not all of this is about money changing hands. Not all of it is about deliberately seeding viruses. Some guys make mistakes. Russia's had more than one biological accident, and accidents that release mycotoxins are as bad as deliberate release of those same agents. Again, arguing for much stricter controls on laboratories.
So Sam, there were two questions related to your China comments. I'm going to combine them. Could you give some color to your suggestion that we increase counterintelligence with respect to Chinese students and scientists working here? And do you think American scientists are unaware of the spying dimension, where their Chinese colleagues are willfully ignoring it?
Yeah, I mean, all of the above. Willfully ignore it, don't want to think about it, doesn't fit with their worldview, all of that kind of thing in regard to U.S. scientists. What should we be doing against this threat? First of all, we should have far fewer Chinese with far more limited access on our soil. Second, we ought to have a much more robust counterintelligence posture from the standpoint of identifying those people that are spying. And third, not to get down into the weeds in tradecraft, when we arrest or when we detect some of these spies, instead of always arresting them or sending them home, what we ought to be doing is trying to, what we would call in the trade, double them, which is, okay, that's great, you're going to stay in place now, and from this point on, what you pass to Beijing is what we give you to pass to Beijing, and everything Beijing tells you, you tell us, which is in a counterintelligence posture a lot more effective than sending a guy home because you know the Chinese will replace him the next day. Right? The Brits did this during the Second World War. They ended up doubling every German agent on their soil throughout the entire Second World War, which meant Berlin saw from their sources what the Brits wanted them to see. Anyway, without getting lost in the tradecraft, I mean, that's what it means is a lot more serious, lot more robust effort against this threat.
Who is the biggest threat right now? China, North Korea, or the Islamic world, including Muslim Brotherhood, Iran, and Turkey?
If you're asking me, the Chinese.
Okay. Shoshana, do you have a?
Yeah, I would agree. Look, I'm not sure that we want to be ranking threats. China has a very sophisticated network through which it does lots of different things that threaten the United States and threaten our allies. North Korea is more volatile, perhaps, and particularly now there appears to be some tension between Kim Jong-un and his sister vying for control at the top. So that could make them a little bit less stable. Not that they were stable before, but I'm not sure it's a good idea to rank them. China is now known to us to be doing bad things, and we need to deal with China. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be able to walk and chew gum and also deal with Iran and Syria and other parts of the world that are a problem for you.
What viable measures can we add for deterrence? And can you tell us a bit about how bad actors might handle the potential for blowback? Is China, after its months of lockdown measures, better prepared to stop blowback if it unleashes another disease?
Blowback meaning things that affect them, that we're not supposed to affect them.
I guess,
just remember that China's interest in the health and security of its population is minimal to none. Okay, the original way that they dealt with the Wuhan virus was to weld people's doors shut so they couldn't get out and escape it. Blowback isn't their problem. That's not what they care about. What they care about is their own economic security and security of the Chinese Communist Party. So they're not looking at the same things we are. The role of their citizens in this is a minimal problem for them.
At the beginning of the pandemic, it seems that China took advantage of its status as the primary manufacturer of PPE. Are we taking measures to prevent this weakness in the future?
Well, I think we are taking measures now, but to go back to something we were talking about a little while ago, talk about preparation, you're talking about exercising, you're talking about planning. How long could you go into a process of preparing for the possibility of a pandemic, naturally occurring or deliberately caused, and not have to confront the fact that if we're serious about it as a country, and this will be a sustained thing, we must face the fact that we're not going to be able to access the personal protective equipment that we need. If that's a serious exercise and a serious planning process, then a decade, 2 decades ago, as we were busily shutting down factories and exporting our manufacturing base, somebody at a national level would have been saying, well, if this thing goes on for longer than 90 days and affects more than X number of people, we're going to run out of everything we need to combat it. And the answer can't be build warehouses everywhere and stockpile stuff indefinitely. It should be stop allowing all of this manufacturing to move to China. I mean, we do this with shipbuilding, right? We do this with other essential national defense industries to retain the capacity to build missiles, rockets, aircraft carriers. This should have been one of those things. We never should have been in the situation of having to say, hey, if the Chinese won't send us masks, we won't have any.
For the first time in this hour, I'm going to disagree with you slightly. We do maintain a lot of our defense industries and our capabilities here, but I would simply point to rare earth minerals and say that if the Chinese cut us off, we are in big trouble. We need to bring supply lines for a lot of things back to this country, not just PPE. PPE is fairly simple to reorganize, and we did. We reorganized it. We make it here now. For the long term, no, you have to do better. But rare earth minerals, we get them from China, and those are crucial to national defense, and we don't own them. So, you know, this thing starts in one place and it ends up in an entirely different place. And what it really says is that we've been very lax with very large parts of our national future.
Let me take one more quick question here. How much expertise would it actually take for a terrorist group to successfully launch a biological weapon?
Almost none. This is one of these things where somehow or another people conceptualize that there are maybe 6 guys on the planet who know how to do this, and we need some exotic lab. What you need is lab equipment that you can buy over the internet. And in terms of skills, what you really want is a guy who's been a decent lab tech. There's no sophisticated science. It's all pretty straightforward cultivating of things. So almost none. So you could do it in an apartment with stuff you bought up from Amazon.
And people have been doing that for a very long time. I mean, you can start with the plague of Athens in 430 BC. Thucydides wrote about the plague of Athens, which possibly was caused by biological agents in spoiled and rotten food. In the Middle Ages, they used to take diseased animal bodies and throw them over the walls of castles. It's not hard. There are all kinds of things out there in the world that can poison you. You don't even need Amazon. Spoiled stuff will do it for you.
If I might interject, as both of the panelists said earlier, all you have to do is send somebody in to get the disease and then send that person out to spread the disease. And that doesn't take any expertise. You just need somebody who's willing to be a martyr.
And there are lots of those.
Yes, unfortunately.
Well, Mr. Faddis and Mrs. Bryen, thank you very much. This has been extremely enlightening, although not necessarily a pleasant conversation. But everybody needs to get this book. I mean, this is an example of 2 of the co-authors of this book. And if this is just a sample of the talent and expertise that went into creating this book, everybody in America needs to read this book. So thank you all both for joining us today. And I hope one day I get to meet you in person.
Thank you.